For 12 years, my phone had been silent. No birthday texts. No how are you calls. No sign that my parents remembered they had a second son at all. I had built a life so far from theirs that I sometimes forgot I came from anywhere in particular. I had a company with my name on the door, employees who trusted me, a version of myself I had built brick by brick with no help from the people who were supposed to give me a foundation. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer, the area code was unfamiliar, but something in me recognized it anyway, the way your body remembers a smell from childhood before your mind catches up. Ethan, my mother's voice cracked on the other end. We need your help. I stood frozen in my office, looking out over a city skyline that had nothing to do with the small town I grew up in. 12 years of silence collapsed into a single sentence. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her where that voice had been on every birthday, every science fair, every empty chair at every table I ever sat at alone. My assistant knocked softly on the glass door, saw my face, and quietly backed away. Outside, the city kept moving, cars, pedestrians, a life I had built entirely without the woman now crying on the other end of the line. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, as if that might somehow bring the sentence into focus, might make it mean something other than what it so plainly meant. Instead, I said nothing for a long moment. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Why now? There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then she said my father's name, and the word hospital, and something in my chest went cold and very still, the way it used to when I was a boy bracing myself for another disappointment before it had even fully arrived. What followed was a conversation that would drag me back into a house I swore I'd never enter again, toward a family that had spent years pretending I didn't exist, and toward a version of forgiveness I never thought I'd be capable of giving. This is the story of how a family that ignored me for years came crawling back, and how I learned that healing doesn't mean going back to who you used to be. It's a story about invisibility, and about the strange, complicated work of being seen again by people who once looked straight through you. I was 8 years old when I first understood, really understood, that I was invisible in my own family. I'd spent 3 weeks building a working volcano model for the Lincoln Elementary Science Fair, not the baking soda kind that every kid did, but one with a real chemical reaction I'd read about in a library book. With layers of papier-mâché I'd shaped myself after school while my parents were at Jason's baseball practice. I mixed the compounds twice in secret in the garage, terrified of getting it wrong, checking and rechecking the ratios against the library book propped open on an overturned bucket. I remember the pride I felt carrying it into the gymnasium the morning of the fair, careful not to jostle it, my hands sweating on the cardboard base, my heart thudding with the particular hope that only an 8-year-old can still hold onto without embarrassment. The gym filled up with folding chairs and parents holding cameras, the smell of vinegar and glue and cafeteria floor wax thick in the air. Kids around me were pointing out their moms and dads in the crowd, tugging sleeves, waving. I kept looking at the door, waiting for my mom's blue coat, my dad's tall frame ducking through the entrance. I told myself they were just running late. Traffic, maybe. Or dad's meeting had gone long. I rehearsed, quietly to myself, the exact words I'd used to explain my volcano to them when they finally arrived, how the reaction worked, why I'd chosen the layers I had, all the little details I'd been saving up just for them. They never came. I won second place in my grade. I remember the judge, a kind woman with reading glasses pushed up into grey hair, handing me a ribbon and asking, "Are your parents here? They must be so proud." I told her they were coming. I don't know why I lied. Maybe because saying the truth out loud would have made it real that they weren't coming because Jason had a baseball game, and Jason's baseball games always came first. She smiled at me anyway, a little too kindly, in the way adults smile when they've already guessed the truth and are choosing not to say it out loud. I rode home with my friend's mom, ribbon in my lap, staring out the window at houses passing by, wondering what it would feel like to matter as much as a baseball game. When I got home that evening, my volcano still carefully balanced on my knees, my parents were already back from Jason's game, celebrating a home run over pizza in the kitchen. Nobody asked how the fair had gone. I set the ribbon on the counter where they'd surely see it. By morning, someone had moved it to make room for the mail. My brother Jason was 2 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, He was the sun our entire family orbited. He was good at baseball, not great, not exceptional, just good enough that my dad, who'd played in college and never quite let go of the dream, saw in Jason a second chance at glory. Our living room walls told the whole story without anyone having to say it out loud: framed team photos, a shelf of little gold plastic trophies, a corkboard entirely devoted to newspaper clippings of Jason's little league box scores. There wasn't a single frame anywhere in that house with my face in it. I was good at other things. Straight A's every semester. A stack of certificates for reading, for math, for science, that I kept in a showbox under my bed because there was no wall in our house where they'd ever be hung. I won a statewide Young Scientist Award in 6th grade, not just a class ribbon, but something that made the local newspaper, a real photograph of me holding my project next to a headline about young talent in our district. My picture ran in print with a caption identifying me as a gifted student to watch. My dad's response, when my mom showed him the paper, was, "That's nice. Did you record the highlights from Jason's game?" My mother, to her credit, at least skimmed the article before setting it down on the counter, where it sat for 2 days before disappearing into the recycling bin along with the coupon flyers. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was worse than cruelty, it was indifference. Cruelty at least acknowledges you exist enough to hurt you. Indifference erases you. Slowly, I stopped bringing home my report cards to show them. I stopped mentioning the awards. I started keeping my achievements to myself, the way you'd hide something fragile from people who kept dropping things. I told my teachers not to call home about good news anymore, only bad, because good news seemed to have nowhere to land in our house, while bad news, at least, guaranteed I'd be noticed for a moment. I became very good at being invisible, because invisibility, at least, didn't disappoint me. I learned to sit at the edge of family conversations without needing anything from them. I learned to celebrate my own successes quietly, alone in my room, turning a good grade over in my hands like a secret I wasn't ready to share with people who wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. The year I turned 11, my birthday fell on a Thursday. I woke up that morning with the small, stupid hope that maybe this year would be different, that maybe there'd be a cake on the counter, a card propped against my cereal bowl, something. I lay in bed for an extra few minutes before getting up, listening for sounds of movement downstairs, some sign that today was being treated as different from any other Thursday. There was nothing. My mom left for work without a word beyond good morning. My dad had already gone. I walked into the kitchen and stood there for a long time, looking at the empty counter, feeling something inside my chest quietly close up like a fist. I checked the calendar on the fridge, half expecting to find my birthday circled in red the way Jason's game days always were. It wasn't marked at all. It was as if the date itself had simply never been entered anywhere that mattered. At school, my friend Marcus noticed I looked off and asked what was wrong. When I told him it was my birthday and nobody at home remembered, he didn't say anything dramatic. He just said, "Well, we're not going to forget," and at lunch, he and 2 other friends had scraped together enough allowance money to buy a cupcake from the vending machine, and they sang to me in the cafeteria, off-key and too loud, drawing looks from the lunch monitors, and it was the best birthday I'd had in years. I still remember the taste of that cheap vending machine cupcake, slightly stale, frosting too sweet, and how it tasted better to me than any birthday cake ever had before or since, simply because someone had bothered. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision that would quietly shape the next decade of my life. I decided to stop expecting anything from my parents. Not out of bitterness, I was 11, I didn't have the vocabulary for bitterness yet, but out of a kind of self-preservation. If I stopped expecting, I reasoned, I could stop being disappointed. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity children sometimes have, that hope was the thing making this hurt, and if I could just get rid of the hope, the hurt might go with it. It was the first wall I ever built around my heart, and it would not be the last. I got very good, in the years that followed, at building walls quietly, brick by brick, so that no one, including myself, ever noticed I was doing it. By the time I was 16, the public library had become more of a home to me than my actual house. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Ferris, kept a corner table open for me most afternoons, and it was there, buried in a stack of financial aid guides, that I found the thing that would change the entire trajectory of my life, A full-ride scholarship program for first-generation and academically exceptional students, sponsored by a foundation connected to Westbridge University. Mrs. Ferris was the first adult who ever asked me, seriously and repeatedly, what I wanted for myself, not what my parents wanted, not what Jason needed, just me. It sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. I didn't tell my parents I was applying. There didn't seem to be a point. I filled out essay after essay in the library after school, writing about resilience, about self-reliance, about lessons I'd learned that I never explicitly named as coming from neglect, because at 16 I still didn't fully understand what I'd lived through, I just knew I had survived it. Mrs. Ferris read every draft, circling sentences in red pen, pushing me to say things more honestly than I was used to saying anything about my life. "You keep writing around the truth," she told me once. "Just write it." 6 months later, an acceptance letter arrived. Full tuition. Room and board covered. A stipend for books. I remember holding that letter in the kitchen, waiting for my parents to come home, thinking that surely this would be the thing that finally made them see me. I'd rehearsed how I'd tell them, imagined my mother's face lighting up, my father clapping me on the shoulder the way he did with Jason after a good game. When my dad read it, he nodded slowly and said, "Good for you," before turning back to the television, where Jason's college recruiter had just called about a partial athletic scholarship to a state school. My mother read the letter after him, said "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in a tone that suggested she was already thinking about something else, and set it down on the counter next to a stack of unopened mail. That night, we didn't celebrate my full ride. We celebrated Jason's partial one, with a store-bought cake and my mother's tears of pride, candles flickering over a cake that had nothing to do with me. I sat in my room upstairs, listening to their laughter drift up through the floor, and I felt something settle inside me, not sadness this time, but resolve. I was leaving. Not just for school. I was leaving. High school graduation came in May. I gave the salutatorian speech, my hands shaking as I looked out over a crowd of families holding balloons and flowers, searching out of habit more than hope for my parents' faces. I'd written that speech about perseverance, about the idea that hard things shape you into someone stronger, and I remember delivering it while looking just over the heads of the crowd, unable to fully meet anyone's eyes. They were there, for about 40 minutes. Long enough to see me walk across the stage. Long enough for a single photo, my mother snapping it quickly on her phone before glancing at her watch. Then my dad leaned over and whispered that Jason's summer league game started in half an hour across town, and could we hurry this along? I remember the exact chill of that sentence, spoken so casually, as if my graduation were simply an errand to be completed on the way to something that actually mattered. We didn't have a graduation dinner. We didn't have a family celebration. I ate a sandwich alone in my room that night while, somewhere across town, my parents cheered from bleachers for my brother. I came home that night, or rather, I was already home, having never left, and packed the boxes I had already quietly prepared over the previous month, folding shirts and stacking books with a strange, calm deliberateness, the kind that comes only after a decision has already fully settled inside you. The next morning, while they slept, I loaded everything into my used Honda Civic that I'd bought with money from 3 years of part-time jobs, a grocery store stockroom, a summer landscaping crew, tutoring younger kids in math after school, and I drove to Westbridge University 400 miles away. I left a note on the kitchen counter. It said, "I've gone to start college. Thank you for everything you did give me. I'll be fine." I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't leave a phone number, though they had it already and had simply never used it. I drove for 6 hours with the radio off, feeling something like grief and something like freedom occupying the same space in my chest, and I didn't look back. Somewhere around the state line, I remember rolling down the window and letting the wind fill the car, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry not out of sadness exactly, but out of the sheer release of finally driving toward something instead of waiting for something that would never come. College was the first time in my life I felt like I existed in full color. I joined a robotics club and found, for the first time, adults who looked at my work and actually saw it, professors who stayed late to help me refine a project, a mentor named Dr. Alvarez who told me, in my sophomore year, that I had the kind of mind that builds things nobody's thought to build yet. I remember sitting in his office after he said that, blinking back tears I didn't want him to see, because it was the first time an adult had ever said something like that to me and meant it. I built my first prototype, a small logistics software tool, in my dorm room during my junior year, mostly to solve a problem I'd noticed in a part-time warehouse job, where I watched managers waste hours each week manually tracking inventory that could easily have been automated. I brought the idea to two friends from the robotics club, Priya and Marcus, a different Marcus than my childhood friend, though I never lost the sense of gratitude I still carried for the original one, and by senior year, that dorm room idea had become a real company, with a small seed investment from a local accelerator that believed in us before anyone else did. Over the following 8 years, that company grew from 3 people in a converted garage to a business with over 200 employees and clients across the country. I was profiled in an industry magazine as one of the founders to watch under 40, a framed copy of which still hangs, half joking and half earnest, in my office, the only piece of press about me that anyone had ever bothered to display anywhere. I built a life stacked with things my childhood self couldn't have imagined: a beautiful apartment with windows that caught the morning light, a team that respected me and asked my opinion before I had to offer it, friendships that had become a chosen family, a quiet, hard-won sense of peace I'd built entirely from scratch, the same way I'd once built a volcano nobody came to see. Not once, in all those years, did my parents reach out. Not once did I reach out to them. No calls on my birthday, no card when the company was written up in the papers, no acknowledgement at all that I existed somewhere out there, building a life. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest relationship we'd ever had, an agreement neither of us ever spoke aloud, that we would simply let each other go. The call came on a Tuesday. My father had retired the year before, my mother later told me, and without his full salary, and after some bad investments Jason had talked him into, the family had lost almost everything: the house, most of their savings, and, according to my mother's shaking voice on the phone, nearly their sense of who they were. She spoke quickly, disjointedly, the way people do when they've been holding something in for too long and it finally breaks loose all at once. "Your father's in the hospital," she said. "His heart. Ethan, please. We don't know who else to call." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, watching the afternoon light move slowly across my office floor. 12 years, and the first time they called, it was because they needed something. Not because they wondered how I was. Not because they'd finally remembered my birthday, or asked about the company whose name they'd surely seen once or twice by now if they'd bothered to look. Because they needed me. Old instincts rose up fast and familiar, the instinct to protect myself, to hang up, to let the silence that had defined our relationship for over a decade simply continue on as it always had. Some part of me wanted exactly that. But another part of me, the part that had built an entire company, an entire life, out of the wreckage of being unseen, wanted to know, once and for all, what would happen if I showed up anyway. Not for them. For myself. I needed to know whether I was the kind of person who could walk back into that house and still recognize who I'd become, or whether 12 years of distance had been a kind of illusion, a wall that would crumble the instant I heard my mother cry. "I'll come," I said. The drive back took 6 hours, the same 6 hours in reverse that I'd once driven with the radio off and my chest tight with relief. This time, the silence in the car felt different, heavier, older, weighted with a decade's worth of unanswered questions I hadn't let myself ask in years. I stopped once at a gas station halfway there, standing in the parking lot longer than I needed to, watching the highway traffic pass, working up the nerve to keep going. The town looked smaller than I remembered, the way places from childhood always do: the same water tower, the same faded diner sign, streets that had once felt enormous now shrunk down to something I could have walked in an afternoon. I found the hospital, found the right floor, and stood outside my father's room for a full minute before I could make myself walk in, my hand resting on the door handle, my heart doing something complicated and hard to name. He looked smaller too. Wires and monitors, a paper-thin hospital gown, grey stubble on a face that used to look larger than life to me, the same face that used to loom over dinner tables and baseball fields, now reduced to something fragile in a hospital bed. When he saw me, something moved across his face, not quite shame, not quite relief, something tangled between the two, an expression I'd never once seen him wear in 20-some years of watching him. "Ethan," he said, voice hoarse. "You came." "I came for Mom," I said. It wasn't entirely true, but it felt important to say, a small necessary armor against whatever this visit was about to become. He nodded slowly, and then, unprompted, in a voice I'd never heard him use before, quieter, rawer, stripped of the certainty that had always characterized him, he said, "I made a lot of mistakes with you, son. I know that now. I didn't know it then, but I know it now." I didn't respond. I just stood there, 12 years of silence pressing against my ribs, and let the moment be as uncomfortable as it needed to be. Some part of me had expected excuses, deflections, the same casual indifference I'd grown up with. Instead, there was just this, a tired old man in a hospital bed, finally saying a true thing out loud, decades too late, and me standing there not knowing what to do with it. Over the following days, staying in a hotel rather than the house I'd once fled, a house that, I would soon learn, no longer even belonged to them, I learned the fuller picture. My father's retirement fund had been mismanaged by a financial advisor Jason had recommended. The house had already been sold to cover medical debt from an earlier health scare nobody had told me about, a small stroke my father had suffered 2 years earlier that I only learned of secondhand, in passing, as though it were a minor detail rather than something that should have prompted at least one phone call to his other son. Jason, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, had lost his own job after a business venture, one funded partly by our parents' remaining savings, had collapsed spectacularly, taking a good chunk of what was left of the family's finances down with it. My mother told me all of this in a diner near the hospital, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she never drank from, unable to look at me directly, her eyes fixed instead on the sugar packets lined up neatly in their little caddy between us. She looked older than her years, tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. "We didn't call because your father is sick," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we did. But that's not all of it. We called because we don't know how to fix any of this. And you're the only one of us who ever knew how to build something out of nothing." There it was. 12 years of silence, broken not by love rediscovered, but by desperation. I felt something in me go very still and very cold, and very clear, the way water freezes all at once when it finally reaches the right temperature. I thought of the ribbon left on the counter. The birthday nobody remembered. The graduation cut short for a summer league game. And now, finally, the truth of why the silence had broken. "So you need my help," I said. "Not me. My help." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence that followed said everything her words hadn't managed to. 2 days later, my father was stable enough to talk at length, and he asked me to sit with him alone. The nurse had just left after checking his vitals, and the room fell into that particular quiet that hospital rooms get in the late afternoon, the beeping monitor the only sound between us. What followed was the first real conversation we'd ever had. "I always told myself you were fine," he said, staring at the ceiling rather than at me, his hands folded over the blanket. "You never seemed to need anything. You did your homework, you didn't get in trouble, you didn't ask for attention the way Jason did. So I gave my attention to the one who was asking for it. I told myself that was fair, somehow. That you didn't need me the way he did. I needed you," I said quietly. "I just stopped asking. There's a difference, Dad, and it took me a long time to understand it myself." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on something difficult to swallow. "Then, that's the worst mistake I ever made as a father. Not that I favored your brother. That I mistook your silence for contentment. A good kid never has to be a loud kid to deserve being seen. I know that now. I think some part of me always knew it, and just found it easier not to look at. It wasn't an excuse. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't excusing himself. He wasn't blaming his own upbringing, or stress at work, or anything outside himself. He was simply telling the truth, plainly, without flinching, and something about the plainness of it cracked something open in me that I hadn't expected, not forgiveness yet, not even close, but a small, grudging respect for a man finally willing to look at the thing he'd spent years avoiding. My mother's confession came later, in the hospital parking lot, of all places, standing beside her car with her keys clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The evening had turned cold, and neither of us moved to get inside, as if leaving the conversation unfinished would somehow mean it hadn't fully happened. "Jason needed more from me," she said, tears finally breaking loose, her voice shaking. "He was anxious, he needed constant reassurance, He needed me to show up to every game or he'd spiral for days afterward. You were just steady. Steady in a way that felt like a relief after dealing with him. I told myself steady meant you didn't need me as much. I chose the child who seemed like he'd fall apart without me, and I let the child who could actually hold himself together do exactly that alone, over and over, for years. I've carried that for years, Ethan. I've known, somewhere, for years, and I didn't know how to face it, so I just didn't. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing what little makeup she had left. There were nights I'd lie awake thinking about the science fair. About your birthday. I told myself you'd forgotten, that kids forget things like that you were probably fine. I think I needed you to be fine, because if you weren't, it meant I'd failed you, and I didn't know what to do with that failure, so I buried it instead. I watched my mother cry in a hospital parking lot for the childhood she'd failed to give me, and I felt an old, familiar ache rise in my chest, not triumph, not quite forgiveness either, but something like recognition. She was finally seeing me. 12 years too late, but she was seeing me, and some small, stubborn part of that 8-year-old boy with the volcano still standing at the door of a gymnasium felt, for the first time, a flicker of something like being understood. That evening, I sat both my parents down in the small hospital family lounge, empty except for us and a muted television playing the evening news in the corner, and I told them, calmly, without raising my voice. Everything I had carried for over 2 decades. I told them about the science fair, the volcano I'd built alone, the ribbon that ended up under the mail. About the birthday nobody remembered, and the vending machine cupcake that meant more to me than any store-bought cake ever could have. About graduation, and the drive home in silence, and packing my boxes while they slept, careful not to wake them, careful to leave without a scene. I told them about the nights I'd stayed up in my dorm room, teaching myself to code because nobody else was going to teach me anything, about the loneliness of building something entirely by myself and having no one to call when it finally worked. I told them that I built a company not to prove them wrong, exactly, though there had certainly been a version of me who wanted that too, but because building things was the only way I'd ever learned to feel like I mattered, the only language I had for being seen when nobody was looking. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply laid the truth down between us, piece by piece, like setting down a heavy bag I'd carried for years and finally had somewhere safe to put it. My father sat with his hands folded in his lap, nodding slowly at intervals, his eyes wet but not spilling over. My mother cried quietly throughout, dabbing at her face with a tissue from the box on the side table, never once interrupting. I'm not here for revenge, I told them, when I'd finally said everything I needed to say. I'm not here to make you feel as small as I felt for all those years. I'm here because I'm curious what happens next. That's all. I don't know yet what this is. I just know I couldn't keep carrying it silently anymore, the way I always used to. A week later, once my father was discharged, my parents asked me to sit with them at my mother's sister's kitchen table, in the small apartment they were now renting after the house was gone. The apartment was cramped and unfamiliar, boxes still stacked against one wall, and it struck me, sitting there, how strange it was to see my parents diminished like this, not just financially, but in the way people are diminished when the life they built turns out to be smaller and more fragile than they'd believed. We want to ask you something, my father said, glancing at my mother first, and I braced myself for a request for money, already running numbers in my head, already deciding what I could offer and what I couldn't. We don't just need financial help, my mother said instead, cutting to what mattered before he could finish making it sound transactional. Her hands were folded tightly on the table in front of her, like she was holding herself together by sheer effort. We know we don't deserve to ask you for anything at all, honestly, after everything. But we want a chance, not to fix the money, that's not really the point anymore, but to fix us. To have a relationship with the son we should have paid attention to all along. If you'll let us. We understand if it's too late. We just needed to ask, at least once, properly. It wasn't the request I expected. Money would have been simple, in a strange way, a transaction I could evaluate with a clear head, write a check, feel the satisfaction of having done something measurable and then walk away with a clean conscience. This was harder. This was an ask for something I wasn't sure I had left to give, something that couldn't be resolved with a wire transfer or a signature on a form. Jason came the next day, driving in from 2 towns over, looking older and more worn down than the golden boy I remembered from childhood, thinner in the face, a little grey already threading through his hair, none of the easy confidence he used to carry like a birthright. He sat across from me at a coffee shop, turning his cup in slow circles before he spoke, unable, it seemed, to find the right place to start. "I didn't understand what was happening to you when we were kids," he said finally. "I was a kid too, and I liked the attention, God help me, I liked it a lot, and I never once thought about what it cost you to give it to me, even though I never asked for it directly. I found out a few years ago, actually, Mom let something slip about the science fair one Christmas, some offhand comment about how she wished she'd gone, and I realized I didn't even remember you being there that day. I didn't remember because I never noticed you were missing something. That's its own kind of awful, isn't it? Not even noticing someone else is disappearing right in front of you." "It is," I said, and I meant it. There was something almost worse about being forgotten so completely that your absence didn't even register as an absence. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," he said, looking at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "I know that's not something I get to demand from you, especially not over one coffee after 12 years. I just needed you to know I see it now. All of it. The favoritism, the attention, all the ways it wasn't fair to you, even when I wasn't the one making the rules. It was, in its own way, the most honest thing my brother had ever said to me, and sitting there across from him, I felt the first small crack of something that might, eventually, become a real relationship between us. I told them all I needed time. Not forever, just time. I drove back to my apartment in the city, back to my company, back to the life I'd built entirely without them, and for a while I didn't call. I didn't visit. I let my phone sit quiet the way theirs had sat quiet for 12 years, though this time it wasn't cruelty, it was simply the space I needed to figure out what, if anything, I wanted to rebuild, and whether rebuilding was even something I was capable of after so many years spent learning to live without it. My mother called my office once, and my assistant told me later that she'd sounded frightened, asking if I was all right, saying she was worried they'd finally lost me for good after getting me back for only a few weeks. I understood the fear, even as I let the call go to voicemail. I'd spent my whole life learning to survive without them. It made sense that the idea of losing me again, right as they'd found me, would terrify them in a way it never seemed to occur to them to be terrified of losing me the first time, when I was small and it would have been so much easier to hold on. But I needed the silence to think. I spent evenings on my balcony turning the whole thing over, trying to separate what was real from what was simply reflex, the old habit of wanting my parents' approval so badly that I might mistake any attention at all for something worth chasing. I needed to know whether what I felt toward them now was love trying to find its way back, or obligation dressed up as love, guilt wearing the costume of connection. Those are two very different things, and I refused to build anything on the wrong one, not after everything it had taken me to build a life at all. Back at the company, my team welcomed me the way family is supposed to. My co-founder, Priya, who'd known me since our dorm room days, sat with me one evening after everyone else had gone home and asked how the trip had gone. I told her everything, the hospital, the confessions, the request, my silence since. She listened without judgment, the way she always had, and when I finished she said something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. "You don't owe them your childhood back," she said. "But you also don't have to punish yourself by staying closed off if some part of you wants to try. You get to decide what you want, Ethan. Not what's owed. Not what's fair. What you actually want." It was a strange kind of permission, hearing that from someone who'd become more of a sister to me than Jason had ever been a brother. My found family, Priya, my employees, the mentors who'd shaped me, had given me something my blood family never had, the simple, steady experience of being noticed. Despite everything I'd built, the flashbacks still came sometimes, standing at a company gala, watching a father in the crowd hug his son after an award ceremony, feeling that same old 8-year-old ache rise up in my chest uninvited. Success, I learned, doesn't erase childhood. It just gives you a nicer place to feel the ache in. I spent a few months working with a therapist, untangling the difference between forgiveness and forgetting, between having boundaries and having walls. She helped me understand that the two extremes, total reconciliation as if nothing happened, or total severance as punishment, weren't the only options. There was a middle path, one I'd have to build myself, the same way I'd built everything else in my life, carefully, deliberately, on my own terms. Then, 4 months after I'd left, a letter arrived at my office, handwritten, my father's careful, old-fashioned script filling 3 full pages. He didn't ask for money in the letter. He didn't ask for anything at all. He simply wrote out, in full, everything he had done wrong, the science fair, the birthdays, the graduation, the decade of silence, and took responsibility for every piece of it, without excuse, without softening, without asking me to feel sorry for him in return. I'm not writing this because I want something from you, the letter ended. I'm writing it because you deserved an apology decades ago, and I'm ashamed it took losing everything else to finally give you one. If you never call again, I understand. But I needed you to have this in writing, so you'd know it was real, and it was mine. I read that letter 4 times before I picked up my phone. I drove back 4 months after I'd left, this time without the 6-hour silence pressing on my chest. I still felt cautious, still felt the old instinct to protect myself, but underneath it was something new, a small, quiet willingness to see what might be possible. My parents' new apartment was modest, nothing like the house I grew up in, and there was something almost fitting about meeting them somewhere smaller, somewhere that hadn't been the stage for years of my invisibility. New space, I thought. Maybe that's what we needed all along. That first dinner was almost unbearably awkward. Jason came too, and for a long stretch, none of us knew what to say, forks scraping quietly against plates, my mother refilling water glasses that didn't need refilling just to have something to do with her hands. Eventually, it was Jason who broke the silence, asking me, haltingly, about the company, real questions, curious ones, the kind of brother who actually wanted to know you might ask. I found myself answering, and then asking about his life in return, and slowly, imperfectly, something like conversation began to happen at that table for what felt like the first time in our lives. There were tears, too, my mother's, mostly, quiet ones she tried to hide behind her napkin. Nobody pretended the last 12 years hadn't happened. Nobody tried to skip past the hurt to get to the reconciliation faster. We just sat in it together, awkwardly, honestly, for the first time. Before I left that night, I told them clearly what I needed going forward. I told them I was willing to build something new with them, calls, visits, an actual relationship, but that it would never be the family it might have been if things had gone differently. I told them I forgave them, and meant it, but that forgiveness didn't mean pretending the last 20 years hadn't shaped me into someone who needed things done differently now. I need you to actually show up, I told them. Not because I need saving. I don't. I need you to show up because that's what people who love each other do. If you can do that, I'm here. If you can't, I understand that too, but I won't go back to being invisible for anyone, including you. My father nodded, eyes wet, and said only, understood. My mother reached across the table and, for the first time in over a decade, held my hand. In the months that followed, my father did something he had never once done in my childhood. He called just to talk. No emergencies. No requests. Just a Sunday phone call to ask how my week had gone, to ask about a product launch I'd mentioned in passing, to actually remember, details from our last conversation. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, ordinary, almost unremarkable. And that was exactly why it mattered. The ordinary attentiveness he was finally giving me was the thing I had wanted, achingly, my entire childhood, and receiving it now, imperfect and late as it was, still meant something. My mother's growth showed up differently. She started asking questions instead of filling silences with reassurances about Jason. When I mentioned a hard week at work, she didn't pivot to a story about my brother's struggles, the way she always used to. She simply asked, what made it hard? And then she listened to my answer, all the way through, without interrupting. It took her longer to unlearn the habit of comparing us. Old patterns die slowly. But I noticed the effort, month after month, and the effort itself began to matter more to me than perfection ever could have. Jason and I built something neither of us had ever had before, an actual friendship. We started talking every week or two, not out of obligation, but because we genuinely wanted to know each other. He told me things about his own struggles growing up under the weight of being the favorite, the pressure of being the only child who mattered, the fear that if he ever stumbled, he'd lose the only currency he had in the family. I hadn't considered, until he said it, that being the golden child came with its own kind of quiet damage. We were both, in different ways, casualties of the same broken system, an understanding that gave us a strange, unexpected common ground to finally stand on together. 2 years after that first phone call in my office, I returned to Lincoln Elementary, the same gymnasium where an 8-year-old version of me had once waited by the door for parents who never came. This time, I walked in as a guest of honor, there to announce a new scholarship fund I was establishing for students in underfunded science programs, the Lincoln Elementary Forgotten Scholars Fund, named quietly, deliberately, for children who might feel unseen the way I once had. My parents came with me. My father sat in the front row, in a folding chair not unlike the ones that had once stayed empty for me, and this time, he didn't leave early. There was no baseball game pulling him away. There was just his son, standing at the front of a gymnasium, finally being seen. I stood at the podium and looked out at rows of kids not unlike the one I used to be, kids with homemade projects clutched in careful hands, kids scanning the crowd for faces that might or might not show up. I spent a long time, I told them, believing that if my own parents didn't notice me, it meant I wasn't worth noticing. It took me 20 years to understand that isn't true. Never measure your worth by someone else's attention. Your worth was never up for debate. It was there the whole time, whether anyone in the room happened to be looking or not. I saw a few parents in the crowd shift uncomfortably, the way people do when a truth lands closer than they expected. I saw my own father, in the front row, wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. My parents never became perfect. They never became the parents who would have shown up to every science fair, every birthday, every graduation, if I could somehow rewind 20 years and give them a second chance at the beginning instead of the end. That version of them doesn't exist, and pretending it could have is its own kind of lie. But they became, finally, the parents I needed, now imperfect, trying, present in the small, ordinary ways that matter more than grand gestures ever could. My father calls every Sunday. My mother remembers the details of my life without being reminded. My brother and I talk like actual brothers, not strangers who happen to share a last name. I no longer need their approval. That was the hardest thing to learn, and the most important, that healing doesn't require the people who hurt you to become who you always wished they'd been. It simply requires you to stop waiting on them to decide whether you're worth loving. I chose forgiveness in the end. Not because my parents deserved it, some debts can't ever really be repaid. I chose it because I deserved peace, and forgiveness, it turns out, was the only road that led there. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that 8-year-old boy standing by the gymnasium door with a volcano in his hands, watching it fill up with families who weren't his. I wish I could go back and tell him what I know now, that the empty chair beside him wasn't a verdict on his worth, just a failure that belonged entirely to the adults who should have filled it. He didn't know that then. It's taken me the better part of 2 decades, and a phone call I almost didn't answer, to finally believe it myself.